We're now live with the November 20th meeting of the Node.js modules team. I'm joined by 6 other individuals, 5 of whom are active members, meaning that we currently have quorum. We have, not the fullest agenda, but I think enough stuff to talk about. Kicking it off before we start, we do have 2 open requests to add new observers. The first is Corey Farrell, and the second is Derek Lewis. Does anybody have concerns with either of these candidates? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and officially add both of them as observers. Just thinking right here. Cool. Is there anyone who's on the call right now who is not an observer or an active member? Cool. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add those 2 members. I'll close the PRs and whatnot. And then for agenda, we have 4 things on the agenda. Module attributes, RFC, chartering the team, loader hooks, and get package type. Maybe we could start with get package type with a 20-minute time box. Does that seem reasonable to people?
That seems fine to me.
Okay. Does anybody want to kick off the topic?
Sure, I can kick it off. So the issue that was brought to us is there are some tools, loaders, build tools, etc., which want to be able to get information about the format of files within a package boundary. This issue brought up the idea of exposing the type field that we've put in package JSON, which can be com.js or module, and exposing that as a userland API that can be queried by Node. So there are some differences of opinion on what exactly the feature request is and what exactly API design considerations we need to take into account. So from CoffeeScript's perspective, it was brought up in the thread that CoffeeScript wants .coffee files to essentially match whatever the file format of a .js file is within a package boundary. So they want to be able to determine the format of a .js file if it should exist within the package boundary. It could be a hypothetical, and be able to compile and specify that .coffee files compile to that format. For a little bit of history, in case people didn't know it, so CoffeeScript doesn't actually have full control over its build artifacts. Those are controlled by different asset pipelines. And so when a CoffeeScript pipeline is generating files, it's generating .js files generally. And so here they just want to ensure that they are kind of staying true to that, it seems. There are some considerations here in API design-wise, though. We have seen some comments from TypeScript here that they would certainly like a specific API design, perhaps. The API design considerations come around if we should directly expose the type field or the underlying database mappings that we have internally in Node's runtime. I've personally commented on this. I think either is potentially able to fill the use case. I have concerns about misuse and forwards compatibility if we don't expose enough information or enough configurability that people will get disparate systems in place. So an example of this was when they were talking about a use case in the issue thread, they neglected the fact that the .cjs extension actually doesn't populate the way they thought it did in our internal database mappings of extension to file format. And this also repeated itself a little later on in the thread when TypeScript was discussing that they would seek to add a plethora of file extensions specific to TypeScript, such that TypeScript could have a similar user experience to what it has today. And doing so would mean that tools would need to coordinate with TypeScript somehow. So anytime we're talking about these tools, we're talking not just about a single tool, but a potential coordination of tools. You can see this in a real world example where ESLint didn't have access to this API, so it kind of does some workarounds and tries to load files in slightly odd ways in order to get ESLint RC files to load properly with the experimental, well, no longer experimental modules. Well, no longer flagged, but still experimental modules. So we do have some real world examples of things going on that could use this, and we have some kind of design considerations that we should be taking a look at. We do have an old issue in this working group about exposing the ability to configure these file format databases within package.json files themselves. And so that's been cross-referenced near the end of the issue thread here. So I would like to see how people feel about if it's okay to expose this machinery. For one thing, I would also like to see what considerations we have for if we want to just expose the raw field value or the underlying configuration. And finally, I'd like to see how people feel about exposing the ability for users to configure these essentially databases of file extension to format themselves. It doesn't necessarily have to be within package.json or something, but just allowing them to configure it themselves. And then after that, we can take into consideration how they configure it. So yeah, those are the three topics I'd like to bring up. So first one, do people have comments or concerns about exposing this mechanism to users? And if so, are there limitations or other things that might alleviate those concerns?
I guess I have a clarifying question, Brad. So in my mind, an API that would be really useful, and apologies because I haven't had a chance to keep up on the entire thread. But an API that would be useful would be an API that you could pass a path to a file, and it would then tell you, how Node will interpret that file. So I think that's a little bit of a different API than what we've talked about in the past, which was, an API that could parse a file and let you know what, definitively what the type of the file is. So to me, the useful API would be like, hey, how is Node planning on running this file? Not necessarily like what exact format is this file. So I guess the clarifying question specifically would be like, is that in line with the API that's being discussed here? And do you feel the same way that an API like that would be useful?
That sort of API is discussed in two different forms within the issue thread, actually. One is directly exposing the database at a given location. So you could actually query other file types around you. The other is going, as you said, directly from a location to a format.
Would it have to be an existing file? Like, could I make up a file name in a folder and like the API could tell me?
That was what I was imagining.
Presume not.
Oh.
Because
I guess I'm wondering
those
why
files
not,
might
if
not
there's-
actually exist in the case of CoffeeScript, for example.
Right. So, but I mean, is I could make a speculative file path, and as long as it pointed to a directory that existed, you could then look up and see, well, based on its extension and on the package JSON that's nearest to it, this is what we would parse it as if it existed.
That's the exact API that I'm imagining, Jordan. So,
right. But I guess it would be a little tricky if the path didn't have an extension, because that is still needed to be supported for CJS, right? Like if I did /foo, because you wouldn't know what the paths were, but then you could even have that API return like an array of answers, like based on what the priorities it would pick or something. I don't know. That might be more complex.
Well, it could also, I mean, in theory, like right now, I think extensionless falls back to the common JS loader, which could just be assumed to be common JS.
But I mean, extensionless even in the SM could be a directory that has a package JSON with a main. So like, I don't think
that's true.
That's straightforward.
The common JS will resolve index.json too, though. Not sure if that matters in this context.
Right. That's, I mean, like in common JS, it could be .js, .json, .node, and all that. So like that's what I meant, is that if you allow like an API that takes a file path that doesn't exist would have to have some way of returning possibilities when there were multiples.
I'm not sure I understand. Are you suggesting that it also do file path searches for potential resolutions of that?
I mean, I suppose we're getting a
location?
little in the weeds here, but I guess it's more like there's a few different kind of overlapping and related use cases that we could possibly meet here, right? One is like, which loader does it use? And in that case, you don't really have to deal with a real file, and you don't have to deal with the extension searching. You just say it's either this loader or that loader, right? And the common JS loader can encompass all that other stuff. But if you're trying to say what module format is this file going to be interpreted as, that's where it gets a little trickier and more involved through the common JS loader, but also arguably much more useful. And that's where you would need to do file extension searching or mandate that the file exists. Like, you know what I mean? Like you either have those two, you have one of two worlds that you can support. One is we can take a speculative path. The other is based on the file system as it exists, what would it be? But then that second one wouldn't really help the CoffeeScript use case where there isn't necessarily a file.
I don't believe any discussion in the thread has covered this kind of taking a location and resolving it to a different location. So it would only ever have one loader, and that would always be the import loader, at least in the issue as it exists today. And what the import loader sees is the format.
Just to interject, not sure if we have moderation at this point. Salah, did you have your hand up before me?
Go ahead, Jan.
All right. I think the more important thing I would want to point out is that I believe Guy's comment in the thread is spot on, which is this feels like something that really should be a user-led implementation and not us exposing this API. Because when I think of TypeScript, of Webpack, or anybody else who wants this, in most cases, they actually are not interested in hitting the file system, at least not Node's built-in notion of a file system, because they have their own host file system abstraction that might not actually be backed by the actual file system. So my gut feeling, at least, is that we could expose this API and be boxed into supporting a very specific way that it's implemented and that it's exposed. And then it would end up not actually being helpful to any one of these people, because what they actually want is a more generic implementation, or implementation that can take a virtual file system, or it takes callbacks for making the file system interactions. So I think officially supporting an NPM package that does it, maybe, but it feels like something that as a core API is not as useful, because you would also then, if you are using it in the TypeScript compiler, then the TypeScript compiler would need to make sure that it's running on a Node version that has this API, even if the code it's compiling doesn't run on the Node version that runs the compiler. Like it gets really, really weird if this is a built-in API used by tools.
Well,
Can you
I ask,
clarify?
Jan,
Go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna ask what if I wanted to build this userland library right now, what would I have to manually replicate the resolution logic, or are like, because if so, then my next question would be, are there components that Node could support, could expose that would make it easier to build a userland library around that? And there's the question of backwards compat, of course, still exists with any built-in thing, but
well,
I think
so
that's different.
my assumption is that this has nothing to do with resolution, that you would always have a file path you're interested in and you already resolved. Because the resolution, at least any resolution scheme that we have been talking about, is not dependent on the type information. So anything that queries the system would already have a fully resolved path it's interested in. Whether that file path exists or not is a different question, but it would have a path it is querying. So I think that if you look at the thread in Guy's example implementation, like it is literally just, yes, encoding the logic of how we interpret the type fields or how we interpret the package.json metadata. But other than that, it's literally just a relatively small loop of going up the directory tree to look for a package.json and then returning a relatively small bit of information, even if you do full type resolution. So I don't, given the complexity that this problem has so far been shown to have, I'm not sure that there is a meaningful core API that would actually make a difference while still allowing people to actually write the packages that they need, which are explicitly not dependent on Node's notion of a file system, all kind of stuff.
We've got Saleh and then Corey, and then I've got something to add afterwards.
I don't like the looseness of speculation. When we're dealing with the file system, you can speculate, but since you're a tool, you could actually influence the file system. And so giving you a clean API where you can declare how you're going to influence something so that you can speculate accurately, I don't like that loose scenario, honestly. I feel that it's going to require a lot of coordination, and it's going to be hard to make it appealing to everyone equally. It's going to be biased, basically. But I don't mind this idea of there are two things that Node does when it determines package scope, where the package JSON is relative to the path. So it walks up the path until it gets the package JSON. And that existing means now it knows what kind of resolution approach would be taken for a particular extension. I think if we say there are two functions, they are isolated and separate. One tells you which flag, which mode, and then the second function, you say if it's with this mode, what would that file path resolve to? I think those two functions are completely stable. They only require the precondition that if you need to modify pjson files, you do that before calling both functions. And that condition makes speculation not necessarily too much, but it also covers, I believe, the use cases that most tools. I think it covers most cases that tools would be interested in. I'm not sure if others have ones they want to raise. So.
Corey?
Well, so looking at this ticket, I'm not sure this is the API that would actually be useful to me. I think, and I'm sorry if this is unrelated, different thing, but for me, I'd want to know the ultimate result of the resolve, which would include the result of any loader hooks. I know that that's still experimental, but so basically I would, for my use, I'd want to know if a loader hook changed the type, then that would be more important to me than what package JSON says.
Quick time check on this. We've got about probably 5 minutes until we hit our time box. Are people feeling confident with that, or do we want to extend the time? I'm not hearing anyone ask to extend the time, so just be, aware that we've got about 5 minutes left in the discussion for this. Corey, was there anything else that you wanted to bring up?
No, I just wanted to raise that.
Okay, thank you, Corey. Really quickly from me, and then to Brad, I guess like my thought process on this, and maybe it's not as useful as it feels like, is we have the mechanisms and the underlying infrastructure inside of Node to, look at a file, and from that file resolve which transform we're going to be running it through. And, that's consistent. That's an internal implementation. And to me, exposing that seems reasonable, because that core behavior is something that many people may try to emulate and potentially not emulate correctly. So exposing something where you can give, a path, and then have that path at least resolve to, what we would do if we were trying to load that file, to me seems reasonable. But, that may not help with like the CoffeeScript case, for example. Brad, to you.
So we've been talking a lot about if we should expose it. It seems like we can continue debating that. I would like to instead try to shift the topic to if we should allow customizing these format databases, if possible, just since we have limited time. We do have an open issue about that. It's been open since February, and this seems to tie into that. So that's all.
Okay, Guy.
Yeah, I just wanted to take the opportunity here to also stress that the resolver implementation, it is expected that there will be many userland implementations of various aspects of the Node.js resolver. And that's why we have a very clear specification that tries to define the semantics as clearly as any specification would. And that specification should be regarded as the source of truth, not necessarily even the code, ideally, or they should be completely in sync. And a lot of care has been taken to do that. So when we talk about implementations drifting or having those sort of issues in the wild, in those discussions with people and with other tooling and any discussions we have a resolver spec, and the spec defines exactly how these behaviors work and exactly how the semantics work. And if there are questions, that's excellent. We can bring that back to the spec. Maybe we need to highlight the spec better or give it its own page or something, because it's really quite important. But that's all. I just wanted to take the opportunity to stress that. I hope it doesn't eat up too much of the.
So Guy, what I think is maybe missing then, if that's the direction that we want to go, I find that implementation and spec are great, but it also requires tests. And so when you think about what happens at TC39, it's kind of the marrying of all three. You have the spec, then you have the web platform test, then you have the implementation. And the platform tests are an extremely important part of ensuring that various implementations are all compliant. So I do think that if we are going to go in the direction of saying we're expecting other people to implement this, we probably want to have some sort of test suite of the resolver that is separate from Node Core and easily embeddable in other environments.
That's a great suggestion.
Brad?
So I just want to bring up, even though we have a spec, that doesn't mean that things are actually going to follow it to that letter. When we're saying people will implement userland implementations of this, we're often also saying that they're going to extend this. And any example we see pretty much of a new format, TypeScript, JSX, CoffeeScript, anything, is going to break the concept of using our spec, because they don't have a central means to coordinate these formats. This goes beyond this, however. If we ever extend the formats that we support, we also will be breaking that, and we will be forced to have these implementations go out of date. Just as people are concerned that, oh, we will run TypeScript on a version of Node without this API, you could be running TypeScript, an old version that doesn't support the level of module formats that your current Node version supports. It's a two-directional street. And I don't feel comfortable not exposing this, because we are seeing pains already with this. Like, people can implement this on their own, yes, but they can also implement their own HTTP server off the net API. That doesn't mean we should say no just because it can be done. And it doesn't mean we should say no just because a spec exists. HTTP exists as a spec, but that doesn't mean that people want to have different versions of things running without coordination. When we talk about loaders, we often talk about supporting new formats. And if we don't provide a way for these loaders to get the formats in the first place, we seem to have counteracted part of our goals. I don't see having a spec as a means of saying we are forwards compatible here. We need to provide the proper hooks such that our forwards path is supported and has a means to coordinate with the ecosystem. That's all.
So we're over by 2 minutes, just so people have a chance to respond to Brad here. Let's extend by 3 more minutes and call it at 3:35. Jan?
Yeah, I partially agree with Bradley. Yes, if you are running specifically in a loader, you would want to have some sort of information about the currently active extensions. But if you are not, if you're doing pre-compilation with TSC, you still need this map, but you are not running in the same node process that will be running the code that needs the extension map. So having the implementation in Node would mean that you would then need to start Node with the flags that, and then run TSC with the same flags that the final application would run with, which seems really weird. So I think realistically, TSC would have to have this information as a separate channel if it wants to support any kind of pre-compilation. So it could not use the API, even if we had it, just because it would not be reliable outside of a loader.
Saleh?
Yeah, it feels to me that we want that logic ambiently available, so people, when they're compiling to a target, they can, they don't necessarily tie it to the resolver of the instance their code is running in, but rather they would be able to get ambient information based on particular node version or particular target. It feels like we're going to be shipping that logic separate in order for it to be useful for compiling to target. Because, things can be spec'd, but specs change over time. There's just, it opens up a lot of, I'm a fan of actually this API, but I just feel that we have to be careful not to not to leave it that it becomes only useful in one case, and then it creates more problems for many others to try to use it.
Hey, Bradley.
I just want to counterpoint against Jan. You don't actually need to run things the way you're stated. We can take this offline, but if TypeScript does pre-compilation to a supported format, that means they no longer need those things at runtime.
Right, but they would need it at compile time if they want to be able to, for example, evaluate the import against something or want to predict like this. They would have the same problem at compile time that they would have at runtime with a loader and need the same kind of information, generally speaking.
Yes, that is the nature of all loaders. This is not a unique instance to this API. That's true for a large variety of APIs for loaders.
Right, and that's why I'm saying that if Node exposes information to a loader at runtime, but then the same wouldn't work for a tool that does offline transformations because it cannot use the same APIs, then the API is not that useful, because why would the tool then
Why
switch
can't
between
it use that API?
Hey, quick interruption. Is this something that can now be taken offline?
Sure.
Okay, sorry for interrupting, but we've gone over by quite a bit, and we still have a few agenda items. So I think that right now we do not have any conclusion. We'll kick back to GitHub for more discussion. Is there anything else that we should add there right now, or no? Okay, so then the next item on our agenda is the module attributes RFC. I can introduce this one, and then folks may have some content that they wanna add. So this proposal for the module attributes was brought up at TC39 as a response to concerns at W3C and what working group regarding JSON modules. So for a bit of history, JSON modules were spec'd in the HTML spec. They landed. Then at TPAC this summer, a number of folks from different vendors, I think specifically Mozilla and Apple, flagged on security concerns with the current implementation, with the way that they were initially implemented, which is what we support with experimental JSON modules. If you import a JSON file, it will parse during the fetch phase, export only a default object and be a leaf node. The security concerns with how that was spec'd was that you were reliant on a server providing the appropriate MIME type and source over the wire to do what you expected. If you imported thing.json, but a server responded with text/JavaScript and a module, that in turn would then actually just execute a module based on how the loaders work in the browser. This was seen as a security concern, specifically that entry points that are expected to not execute could execute. So the change was reverted from the HTML spec, although some of the underlying infrastructure has begun to be implemented. And it was kind of kicked back to committees to try to come up with a solution to this. And there's been some solutions that have been in-band solutions, which is what this proposal is suggesting. There's out-of-band solutions, which are also being explored. But this proposal specifically is looking at extending the statement that you would make at an import site with extra syntax to allow you to specify the type of the module that you are importing. That's the high level context without getting into the specifics of the implementation. I see we have some hands up, so we should just kick off discussion. Jordan?
There we go. Yeah, so the main thing I want to kind of underscore here, I think it's first of all, it's probably a little premature to talk about here because it hasn't been presented to TC39. I find it highly unlikely that any syntax change will ever be get consensus there. And separately, I also think that these considerations are unique to the web and do not apply to Node, and that I also don't entirely buy the threat model, even though I understand it. Like, to me, if you import something, you are immediately delegating full trust to it. And like, if you don't trust it, you shouldn't import from it. And so if it's a cross-domain file and that you don't control, don't import from it. Like, that's kind of the same thing if you like pull in JavaScript from another domain or whatever, right? Like, the security consideration here is, well, what if some it changes from JSON to JS and then does something you don't like? Well, the same thing exists if it changes from good JS to bad JS. So like, I just don't think that. I think that no matter what the outcome of this is in TC39, like, it, if there's syntax added, of course Node would have to support it. But short of that, I think that any handling of this should stay within the web, and Node should not have a worse UX as a result of it.
Thank you, Jordan. Bradley, and then I have my hand up after Brad.
So minor correction, this isn't specifying the type that's being imported, it's specifying the allowed type to import. So it's not a disambiguation mechanism. We're still using MIME type to determine the format. We're just having an assertion added. I think the big problem here for us as a module working group, I'm uncomfortable stating that we should impose specific security models to match the web. And I'm also unclear how this affects Node and why we should do it. There's the concern that's not really being discussed. If the web requires these attributes, Node must support them if we are to interoperate with the web, or we must ignore them. And I feel that ignoring them would be problematic, as do I feel that using them is also problematic. There are a variety of issues on that repo. I've stated concerns about the actual use of this. I don't think the threats being solved by adding these attributes are, for the most part, realistic. There are a few very minor edge cases which I can believe are potential gains here, where you're importing one level deep without redirects a JSON file from an untrusted origin, but importing CSS and HTML, WASM, all these other things have complications, including things like the templates from HTML modules being able to expand the dependency graph. So even if they're loaded, they can produce side effects later on. WASM, same sort of deal. CSS, you have some attachment issues. These seem to be an odd solution to a problem that I don't believe Node has, and I'm not sold that the web is actually solving what it is stating to solve. I think bringing this here, we should be keen on, can we implement this? Because there's an interoperability issue for us. And should we implement this? For me, I think we can implement this. I absolutely think we can. I absolutely don't think we should, given the current arguments being stated. We are not seeing improvements on our runtime, which makes me skeptical of it in other runtimes. Especially given the threat models discussed, they don't appear to apply to Node or anything we've seen in the security working group. That's all.
Thank you, Brad. I have a bit to add, and then I'll hand it off to Jan. Jordan, you had said like you think it's premature to bring to this group. I disagree with that sentiment primarily because I believe that it is important to get feedback from this group if this is something that will actually move forward at TC39. As Brad was mentioning, you know, like this could be a pivot point that, you know, makes some behavior on the web completely incompatible with Node. So if our, you know, if our conclusion on this is like, you know, we don't want to implement it, then I think that we absolutely should be coming to the committee with that so they can know that while making decisions here. I don't know that I entirely agree, Brad, with your assessment that this has nothing to do with Node. You know, we have discussed the possibility of loading modules over HTTP or HTTPS more specifically. So I do think that if we ever found ourselves in a world where we're loading things over the network, we very much are in the same place from a security perspective. And I understand where you're coming from in saying that you don't think that this is the proper or potentially full solution to the problem that's been identified. I do think, though, that if we want to see JSON modules exist on the web platform, we do need to come up with a solution that is palpable to those who, you know, are the implementers from these different browsers. So if Node wants to have interoperable JSON modules, we have to find a way to come up with something, whether it's in band or out of band, that everyone can get on the same page with. If we can't or we don't, then I guess either we need to actively decide that we're okay with drifting, or alternatively, being in a world where the web platform doesn't get those features. That's my bit for now. Jan?
Yeah. I'm definitely concerned about the current direction of the proposal, which seems to be going towards the full type assertions, which I think is bad, like even on the web. And I think that some of the use cases outlined in the repo for the web are questionable, like protecting for every single kind of file type for accidentally serving the wrong content type headers, but not for JavaScript, seems really weird. But I'm less skeptical about the possibility of having a assertion that says, I want to import this, but I expect it to be static data. Like that seems like a useful primitive to have, even without necessarily even taking into account that HTTPS imports. HTTPS imports definitely make it more valuable, but even without having that as a documentation thing, seems really nice. But yeah, definitely, if the proposal is supposed to move forward with the current scope of literally documenting what kind of file types are acceptable on a very fine-grained level, I don't see us implementing it in Node, and I don't see anybody realistically using it. Like nobody using Webpack will annotate every single import that is not JavaScript with an additional 2 or 3 or 4 tokens, just because technically that's the browser's requirements. Like nobody will write this code and it will never run in the browser.
Not just Webpack, Babel too. Any transpiler or bundler tool. What, like they would obviously use that instead of typing it out is what I'm agreeing with.
Brad?
I think we should be careful about talking with a security model for HTTP in Node. It is very different from what the web is with its same origin policy, because Node can't implement that actually. Dino did, but Dino has a different kind of spun up runtime and sandboxing features that Node doesn't have. So even if we were to implement HTTP loading, I don't believe we can use the web's model. And we've had some discussion about that in the security working group.
I mean, in this context, it's just about the fact that you can say, hey, I want to read this config format from the server, and I expect it to be just data. It's not about origins or anything. It's just about being able to document that I'm not expecting this remote file to execute code, which I think is a nice thing to have.
Well, it's a little bit more than that, because we're talking about trust, and which origins are trusted is a very big part of this proposal.
Right, but in the Node case that we are currently talking about, it's literally on a per URL basis. You say that you explicitly say you don't trust it. It's definitely also different from the web in that this proposal says you need to annotate the ones that you don't trust. So I don't think it's even using the web security model as it's currently spec'd in the proposal.
Oh, go ahead.
Do we have anything else to add for right now, or are we kind of at a bit of a standstill here?
I would just like to check if we would have any problems actually implementing this, because can and should are very different. And I absolutely think we can implement this. Does anybody disagree?
Sorry, Brad, I had one question about implementing this. Where does it factor in the current implementation?
This would just be a format check at the very end of the load operation.
And so a format check, it basically also has to know what format to be checking for. Where does that information get in the pipeline in order for it to be ready at the end to make that kind of assertion?
It would be a parse time, at least according to the current proposal. So the import call site would pass it through the host hooks.
So it's kind of like we're adding a virtual query parameter, like it's a header, really.
Kind of.
For the import statement, the specifier is tagged with the expected type, and then in the end, right before evaluation, you make certain at that point before you evaluate. Okay, thanks.
I think the place where I would see it being problematic is the CommonJS bridge, which would, because we don't actually know what that thing will be. And we can't really forward that information, or at least it would be super awkward to do it. So I assume that we would treat all CommonJS as if it were modules, because from the module loader perspective, it technically is a module. But I think that's the only place where I would see a potential weirdness in the Node implementation.
Okay, so it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, where we're at right now is no one seems to think we wouldn't be able to implement it from a technical perspective. But there are questions about whether or not we should implement it from a philosophical perspective. Would people say that that's an accurate description?
I'm not sure I'd use the word philosophical, but yes.
Okay. some of us are heading to the meeting coming up soon. As someone who's one of the champions of this proposal, you know, like one of the important bits to this would be like, we have to figure out if this has legs. Jordan, you know, the way in which you framed it makes it sound like you do not believe that it has legs. You know, I'll ping you separately. I don't want to put you on the spot in this call, but you know, as a delegate, anyone has the ability to make it really clear that things will not move forward.
To clarify, I do not expect that in any way I will be the lone objector on, or you know, I don't even think I will need to object for this thing not to have legs. I think that that the entire design of the module system and the import syntax, and as Bradley has talked about, the actual security model of the web, and the lack of that security model on other implementations is just not going to fit together here.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we can certainly talk about it more independently, but I do not expect, like, if everyone in the room is staunchly in favor of it, I'm not going to block it. I just will think it's unfortunate because it will make using non-JS modules terrible forever.
And I think with that in mind, what might be useful for us to think of as a group, independent of whether or not it's how we implement it in Node, would be like, what could potential out-of-band solutions be? But for the sake of time, with 4 minutes left, I think maybe we need to wrap this up. There's two more things on the agenda, which one is chartering and the other is hooks. I don't think we really have time to deal with either of those. What do people think? Should we maybe reclaim 3 minutes, call it a day?
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the stream. Thanks for joining anyone who was listening.
Sorry, before we go, I just want to say I'm definitely interested in the loader hooks. Obviously, not time to discuss it in this meeting, but I'm hoping maybe there can be some offline discussions on that.
Great. Is there a particular issue where discussion around loader hooks should be happening, y'all?
Well, for my purposes, I need the ability to implement source level transformations in the module loader. Mainly for my own maintenance purposes for NYC, but obviously for other development tools, I could see that being extremely useful.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the stream now. Thanks everyone for listening.